Hey everybody, John the Other here, obviously. And I have a couple of different topics to mention today. So this is actually a video in a couple parts. And one of them, the first one, is somebody pointed out that I had neglected to mention one of the major arguments that is encapsulated within the larger political demand from the Black Lives Matter movement and its advocates for reparations for slavery. And that is something I previously haven't mentioned, that there is a claim, and my description is going to be approximate here, okay? There is a claim that capital in the form of land or equipment or just privately or even publicly held wealth and capital in the form of material capital that was accumulated either in whole or in part, and I would say it's almost all in part, from the proceeds of business conducted under conditions of slavery, is illegitimately held by whoever holds it, whether it's a local chamber of commerce, or whether it's a farming collective or a private farm or a private manufacturing company or private citizens. Any capital in the form of either money or material capital goods that is owned, that has any taint of slavery in its trail, in its history, the argument is that that's illegitimate, and we must do the forensic accounting and trace back all that money and figure out who would be the inheritors of the descendants of the slaves that were involved in that commercial activity that generated either ownership of land or ownership of equipment or money, and then follow all that money through all of the different transactions and changes of hands, thousands and thousands of transactions, and trace it all and figure out who would be the proper owners of that either money or capital goods or shares in companies or whatever it might be, in whatever fractional way, if the original business endeavor had been collectively owned by the ancestors of the modern descendants, meaning the slaves. And in a purely, ideal world, I guess that makes a sort of sense. The problem is that it is an unsolvable nightmare of accounting, and not just accounting to figure out all those money trails. Like, that's to me, it seems like a totally unsolvable problem. But then you have the issue of all of the people in that train of history who weren't any part of commerce under slavery, who just were conducting normal business, engaging in commerce, producing goods, selling goods, doing farming, manufacturing equipment, repairing trucks, and so on and so forth, who had no part of any slavery business because they happened afterwards. You are now proposing with this logic that you're going to engage in seizure of private property because of that property's history, or seizure of private capital, like of bank accounts or of fractions of bank accounts or of capital equipment, based on the foggy history of that equipment, and seizure of that property from people who had no part of the dirty business of slavery. Which means that if you were to engage in this, what you're actually doing is legitimizing organized theft on a grand scale. Even though you might do it with the taint of moral virtue, because somewhere in the history of some piece of capital goods, a farm or an equipment manufacturing or whatever, there might be some dirty business back there. But the vast majority of the people in that train are actually legitimate actors, and you're proposing to engage in a massively organized and orchestrated theft, seizure, basically seizure of private property and private capital, which is just straight up piracy as far as my particular ethic would be concerned. So yeah, it's a problem, and I think it's an unsolvable mess of horrible spaghetti that we just have to leave alone. The other problem, and there's actually a moral problem that would poison the supposed inheritors, when you go and trace all these lineages, there is a moral position among some elements of the Black Lives Matter reparations community, a sense of entitlement. And the problem with that is it isn't proportional. It's not like an accounting sense. It's a sort of a spiritual, moral sense, and there's no limit to it. The crime of slavery is of such gravity and depth that there is a real tendency that the sense of entitlement vastly outstretches what the actual accounting would be. And so when you begin to trace that and start trying to make these reparations, what you end up with is an endlessly avaricious spirit of entitlement, which doesn't do its recipients any actual good. It actually psychologically cripples them. So there's that kind of spiritual element to it as well. Spiritual, psychological, whatever you want to call that. So that to me is just a gigantic mess of horrible forensic accounting and historical spaghetti that as a society I don't think we want to enter, because it would lead us to a kind of hell for everybody. Thanks for watching and have a lovely day. I totally forgot I was going to talk about another topic. There is in the struggle for freedom of speech within political discourse, within American media, within the what we now think of largely as the commons in terms of social media platforms like Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and YouTube for that matter, and all these other different online digital platforms which are corporate owned. And so then there's this argument that under the private property doctrine, the corporation can limit whoever's speech they want and silence whoever they want and kick whoever they want off. Now there's a second part of that argument under the private property doctrine that you can say, well, they can do that because they're private property, and you can just create your own app or your own platform and go have your free speech there. And the fact that that argument has been thrown out by so many of the advocates for censorship, the legitimacy of censorship under the existing platforms, is, I think, substantially and maybe fatally undermined by the now well-known history of collusion between the major platforms and the major payment processing platforms to interfere with and specifically wall out and exclude any third party that might emerge to try to compete with them, and thus preserve that ideal of having a platform where there's free speech for the public. Gab, the alternative, people call it alt-right, but it's just, as far as I'm concerned, it's just an alternative social media platform, is now being explicitly blocked by platforms like Facebook. The payment processors were blocked by the more established payment processors, and there was canvassing and collusion to not allow these third-party payment processors to operate. And that's fine. That's the blood sport of competition. But as soon as that happens, and it's in the public record as it is, then you don't get to say, well, this is private property, why don't you just go create your own platform, when you block anybody from doing that. So let's not forget about that history. I think I'm actually undecided on this. I'm not sure where I stand, and maybe I'm a little in column A and a little in column B. But the column B in this case, and this is a specifically American thing because it deals with the American Constitution, and I'm, by the way, Canadian, so here I am spouting off on my opinion, which you can now ignore because I'm not an American. But for the people advocating freedom of speech and advocating against censorship, here is a thought to consider that I haven't heard anybody voice before. Facebook and YouTube and all these other techno-giant platforms act as if they are polities. They act as if they are political jurisdictions. They act like countries with their own laws in certain ways. And the American Constitution, First Amendment, says that that government shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, restricting freedom of speech or freedom of the press. Okay, that's the argument that everybody makes, and it's the legal argument for non-restriction of free speech, but then it gets submarined and the legs get cut out as soon as you talk about being on private property. And there is a viewpoint that says that places like Facebook or YouTube can or should be treated as if they are the commons, the town square. Therefore, freedom of speech should be protected, so the government needs to, I don't know, step in. But I think there is a subtler distinction to be made here. And that is that the First Amendment doesn't say the government will not make any law establishing freedom of speech and blah, blah, blah. It doesn't say the government. It says government. So is the administration of Facebook not a form of government? Similarly, if you're on a university campus and there is a speech code in place run by typically by the student government, that isn't explicitly a government that calls itself a government on a university campus, restricting free speech, restricting the establishment of religion, restricting freedom of the press, and so on. That is not the government, it is simply government, and it's government that calls itself government within the territorial boundaries of the United States of America. And this applies just as well, on YouTube, on Instagram, on Twitter, on Twitch, any of these places who have a code of conduct or an unpublished community standards or a vaguely worded, which means they can do whatever the hell they effing want according to their own rules. Each of them, by setting out rules of conduct, by governing the behavior of the citizens of their polity, they are effectively a government. They are definitively a government. And I would say that that's the legal argument to make if you want to hammer on the Constitution as stop shutting people up. And I know I've just created I've completely put the fox among the chickens here, but these conversations are messy, and maybe it's time for that thinking to be expanded a little bit. Anyway, thanks very much for watching, as I said a few minutes ago, and as always, have a lovely day.